Now to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. An increased level of emergency has been declared in Russia's Belgorod region as Ukrainian forces continue their cross-border offensive in neighboring Kursk. Russia's emergencies ministry upgraded the alert to a federal level. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Air Force says it shot down all 29 drones launched from Russia overnight. In a statement, it also said Russia launched 3 guided missiles from the Kursk region, where Ukrainian troops have pressed forward since the incursion, which began last week.
The situation in the region remains difficult and tense. As a result of terrorist attacks by Ukrainian armed forces in the Belgorod region, residential buildings and infrastructure were damaged. There are killed and injured citizens. The region has organized work to provide comprehensive assistance to the affected population. However, the scale of what is happening does not allow the region to independently eliminate the consequences of the current emergency situation. I suggest to classify the emergency situation in the Belgorod region as a federal emergency and establish a federal level of response. The situation in the region remains difficult and tense. As a result of terrorist attacks by Ukrainian armed forces in the Belgorod region, residential buildings and infrastructure were damaged. There are killed and injured citizens. The region has organized work to provide comprehensive assistance to the affected population. However, the scale of what is happening does not allow the region to independently eliminate the consequences of the current emergency situation. I suggest to classify the emergency situation in the Belgorod region as a federal emergency and establish a federal level of response.
Well, for the very latest, let's cross live to London and speak with Arise European Affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. Where are we with that Ukrainian incursion into Russia? We understand that the operation has slowed, but it clearly hasn't stalled.
Quite right. The Ukrainians are still pressing forward to some degree. It's interesting, the word, of course, slowed down. It could be for 2 reasons. Obviously, because the Russians are now resisting more, but it could be that Ukraine has in its mind some sort of territory they want to control, which would be compatible with their saying that they want a sort of buffer region so the Russians can't launch missiles. It has to be said, there's no obvious reason why a small part of Russia like that is a good buffer region, because Russians still have plenty of places and enough, long enough distance for their missiles to be able to launch it from other areas. But however, it could be that the slowing down is because they have in mind a definite frontier.
And it's interesting what you say there, Dr. Laskiewicz, because in the last few hours, Ukraine has announced the setting up of an administrative office in the region of Kursk, saying the office would maintain law and order. What do you make of that announcement?
It implies they're digging in. They want to keep this whole region. It is now no longer an incursion, it is an occupation. And that in that respect, it being an occupation does change the situation. If Russia succeeds in recovering this territory, as I said before, it will be an ever greater blow for Ukraine, because if they're now saying it is de facto a part of Ukraine, administered by Ukraine, it obviously would be a bitter blow to lose it. However, the question still remains, can and when Russia will actually launch any sort of counterattack. At present, it's very quiet, although it could be that they're simply now collecting together their forces and planning what to do.
And we're also seeing reports of Western weapons, I think you mentioned this some time ago, being used in this operation. I mean, that's not a huge surprise, is it, given that most of Ukraine's military equipment is coming from the West?
It's true. However, there is an element of escalation. When the Ukrainians were using this equipment to attack Russians occupying Ukrainian soil, then there was no, how can I put it, no real danger of it going much further. But to use Western weapons on Russian soil and with the full permission of these governments, that really is an escalation. Again, it depends what Putin wants to do and the Russians. In a very real sense, they are confronted with, if they don't do something about this incursion, with a loss of prestige, which will be quite difficult to cope with for Putin personally as well. But however, it has to be said, we do not know the Russian military plans, and it could be they're doing a Zhupov, waiting for the Ukrainians to come to a halt before they launch their counterattack.
And the Ukrainian Air Force says it shot down all 29 drones launched from Russia overnight, and not a single one got through. What does that tell us about the growing strength of Ukraine's military defense capability?
Rather, what it shows is that the West, all sorts of arms are now getting to Ukraine. And if it's true that they shot down the 29 drones, although it has to be said that the journalist saying is truth is the first casualty in a war. So Ukrainian and Russian, how can I put it, statistics and boasting have to be taken carefully. However, assuming it is true, it shows that they're getting ever more sophisticated equipment from the West, that the defense capability in this sense is getting ever better. The effect on Russia, therefore, will be, what do they do about this?
And in terms of the impact all this is having on Russia, I mean, they've declared an increased level of emergency in the Belgorod region. The Russia's emergencies ministry upgrading the alert to a federal level. I mean, what are the implications of that?
Well, the implications, of course, are quite clear, that the Russians themselves realize that there's no immediate ability to withstand the Ukrainian attacks, and so there is the state of emergency. The worry is how the Russian people will respond to this attack on Russian soil. So far, it would appear they're fairly quiescent, but it has to be borne in mind that historically, when Russia itself has been attacked, the Russians tend to rally around the flag. And so, as I said before, I don't think it will shorten the war, and I do hope what it won't do is arouse the Russian nation, because that's, for example, what happened in Hitler's case, when he initially attacked Russia with great success and afterwards ran into problems because the Russian people turned against him full strength.
On the other hand, of course, we're seeing these humanitarian corridors being opened up into Russian territory, with Russians in the Kursk region receiving aid from the Red Cross. I mean, those are powerful optics in terms of morale, aren't they?
Yes, they are. By no means the best optics either. The real problem is the Russians are suddenly on aid, on welfare, to use an Americanism. It does not look good, especially getting it from the Red Cross. The Russians are for a proud nation. So again, as things stand, there is a loss of prestige by Russia. And if they don't act, it's not just Putin, but Russia itself, which will lose this prestige. At the end of the day, Putin wanted to make Russia into a power, that's spelt with a capital P. Well, it's not looking like a power at present. However, the situation is recoverable. The amount of territory the Ukrainians have conquered is small compared to the rest of Russia, or even to the amount the Russians hold in Ukraine. It is also the fact that the Russians have not launched a counterattack yet, so we'll see how that could go. And therefore, the situation is by no means fatal, but as you rightly point out, there is already an effect on morale, and I would expect the Russians to have to do something about this sooner rather than later.
So let me ask you a question that may be impossible to answer. What do you reckon is likely to happen next?
I think the Russians are going to launch a counterattack, myself. I think the Ukrainians can carry on expanding. However, the expansion in itself is like a double-edged sword. The further you go into Russia, the longer the supply lines, the harder it gets. That's the experience of all previous conquerors who've got a long, long way further than Ukraine. And if the Russians do launch a counterattack, it could be beyond Ukraine's abilities to defend it. However, it has to be said that Ukraine's defense capabilities are increasing, and therefore the counterattack is by no means a certainty to succeed. So what do I expect to happen? Ukraine will carry on expanding for a while. It has to, I think, get more of this territory if it's to be a proper buffer region, limited, though it is, as I said before. And secondly, the Russians are almost certain to launch a counterattack, and we'll see how well that goes.
Dr. Laskiewicz, we really appreciate your analysis. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is a RISE European Affairs analyst who was talking to me on the line from London.